Welcome to the Tech Talks Daily Podcast, where you can learn and be inspired by real-world examples of how technology is transforming businesses and reshaping industries in a language everyone can understand. Here is your host, Neil C. Hughes.
Welcome back to the Tech Talks Daily Podcast, where every day we explore a different topic in tech and how it's impacting our world. And today, I want to explore the topic of digital identity, who we are on the internet. My guest today is Max Kirby, who is a big thought leader in digital identity and data privacy because he leads cloud solutions at the Publicis Groupe, that's one of the biggest players in the agency world, and he's helping his clients adapt to new technologies and privacy laws as soon as they come out. And he's also a big believer in the next phase of the internet, the decentralized web, but he also has a unique perspective to share by combining his philosophy background and a career in technology. Intrigued? Me too. So buckle up and hold on tight so I can beam your ears all the way to Martha's Vineyard in the US so we can speak with Max Kirby. So a massive warm welcome to the show, Max. Can you tell the listeners a little about who you are and what you do?
Hi, Neil. Glad to be with you today. Yeah, thanks for letting me on. So my name is Max Kirby. I'm working at Publicis Groupe. And if you don't know Publicis Groupe, that's one of the big four communications companies, agencies, consultancies, systems integrators. And what I do day to day, and I think what we're going to talk about today is manage our digital identity solutions. And so that's anything having to do with who you are in a digital system. This spans a number of different kind of aspects of identity, but mostly we're talking in this context about the types of identities that you have at big platforms that are trying to market to you better, or different kind of systems that are trying to serve you in some way, and it's across individuals, not just sort of the tech people. So we also handle things like IAM and identities for tech systems themselves and when you log in and credentials and all of that. But I think most of the interesting traction around digital identity is happening in the kind of consumer space or the individual space for us as people.
And there's so many reasons I'm excited to get you on the podcast today because you are an expert in digital identity. And for many people that are wondering, well, what does that mean? Well, for my understanding is it's who we are on the web, and actually get you to speak from your philosophy background and technology career to make this complex topic a little bit more simpler. But can you tell me where this passion originated from and what caused these two worlds of philosophy and technology to collide and put you on this path? Because I've got a feeling there's got to be a big story there.
It's not something that you usually see combined. No. Yeah. Well, the best I can put it is, if you think about identity, let's take the digital part out for a sec. If you just think about identity and who you consider yourself to be, and as you engage with the world, how that changes. The best way of explaining identity, I think, is to talk about storytelling, in that if you think about your favorite character or even your own life as a story, what you're going to find is that the changes in your character or your identity in some meaningful way are likely due to some kind of event or experience that you've had. And here's the tricky part, even if that's not actually the case, right? When you look back on your life, you'll think about the experiences that shaped your identity. And the second piece of the kind of analog identity, if you like, to fully get around it, idea of it, is the fact that identities want to stay the same. The body has something called homeostasis. That's that thing that tries to stop you from losing weight because your body doesn't want to lose weight because it considers weight kind of a backup reserve. Personalities work the same way. Identities work the same way, where if they do change, they change slowly, they change incrementally, because we are trying to preserve and stay true to our identity at all times. And that's what I was chiefly focused on from a philosophy perspective, and from the policy world. I didn't necessarily expect the policy world so quickly to now be in combination or clash, even if you like, with the digital world. But we're seeing that play out with things like data privacy laws. Some governments are creating things referred to as citizen data platforms today. And if you ask any Gen Zer, they'll say, I'd rather not pay my taxes via paper, right? And so we're going to kind of hit this question of how, now that our worlds are so digitally described, how is our analog identity, who we are and who we consider ourselves to be as people, and our digital identity, which is who we are online, usually according to someone else, like a very large company trying to track your movements, for instance, how are those going to interplay together? And I think that the real battleground in 2020 is with regards to news content, right? Where what you learn online can actually shift and change your mind and change your identity from one way or another. And some parties are interested in fact, doing that and have figured out that connection. And so we're confronting this as an issue today. But if you really want to deconstruct it, you just need to remember that the digital identity world is based on systems and things of that nature. But the analog identity world is actually providing the foundation upon which digital is building. And so you have to understand both to really get a grasp of what's going on. And for business leaders, you can also think about this in terms of your brand, which has always been an analog thing, right? I mean, the brands existed before digital. So it's an example of the fact that the more things change, the more they stay the same. So it's been a combination of understanding timeless things about who we are and identities in general, and now, the new frontier, which is the digital world.
It's such a fascinating topic and a huge topic right now as well. There's so many people debating it. But I also read a great quote from you recently where you said data does not exist, information does. And that's one of the big misconceptions that can make truly understanding the internet incredibly difficult for people. But can you expand on that and what you meant?
So we found in a number of research studies that we've been conducting, because we're very much interested in this topic and also what it means for our clients. And so we conduct these studies. We found in 2 or 3 that there's this connection between familiarity with how data works and your willingness to share that data. But what I mean when I say that data doesn't exist, information does, is that data is just a standardized way of looking at information, right? I mean, and that's where you get, if there are data scientists listening, the validating the null hypothesis or type 1 and type 2 errors, these are things that are always present in whatever data that you would capture, right? But the actual information that data represents, that's something different. And I could make as much data as I want. I could make infinite amounts of data. I could even make data about other data and so forth and so on. But I can't necessarily change the information that I'm making the data from. Information is something that we generally observe. And it's different from something like knowledge, which is information that we can use for a purpose, right? To some extent, this is around kind of the philosophy of science or the philosophy of technology, if you like. But data really doesn't exist, and that's what's tripping people up and making them kind of unfamiliar with how data works. You talk to the average person on the street about, data and what data is being captured about them and what it's used for. It's very likely that they won't be able to answer that question, or perhaps won't feel comfortable or confident answering that question. But they do understand information, right? They do understand that they wouldn't give someone an answer to a question that was inappropriate, despite the fact that that's kind of what they're doing every day when they log into things or click on things. I mean, the fact that they don't know what information is being shared because they don't have a familiarity with how data works, it's why it's so hard to get an understanding of things like data privacy or explain it to people who are uninitiated on data systems. And so we need to cross that divide and help people understand what and how data works. But we also need to separate it from information, because most people conflate those two terms and they think that data and information are the same things.
And another big question, and apologies for asking this because it is a big one, but how does the internet know who you are, and what does information mean to businesses? Because we want them to know some things and obviously not others. So how do we finesse that?
Let's take it out of the digital for a second again, right?
Yeah.
Let's go back in time, perhaps, so that there's really no digital technology. There were still things like marketplaces, and a good merchant in that marketplace knows their customer, or knows the market around that customer. And merchants for since there's ever been merchants have understood that information is powerful because it helps you determine what should be sold, how it should be sold, what supply you are going to need in order to sell, and other questions of that nature. And we want good merchants, right? If you've had somebody who's say a bespoke tailor, or someone who is taking you to a marketplace in another country, that you're unfamiliar with, we generally look on those figures as very helpful. We don't necessarily see that same concept when we think about intercepting your intent via your searches, or understanding your interests because of what you streamed and watched at home, and then you start seeing an ad for something that is related to that. And many people are reporting that this is happening more and more, and they're starting to get the feeling that everything's listening to them. And to some extent, that's not false, but it's still trying to do the exact same thing. It's trying to be a good merchant. It's trying to make supply meet demand, and we want businesses to serve customers, so we should be willing to give information to businesses in order to serve those customers. The problem comes down to the fact that we don't understand what information we're giving. Whereas in the analog world, in the merchant world, if there's a savvy merchant asking you questions, you can decide whether or not you'd like to answer them because you understand that context. Folks don't really understand that when they click on something or put in an input or expose their intent, that same thing is happening. And so the improperness of it isn't the surveillance nature of it in terms of how they're getting the information. It's the surveillance nature of it in that we don't understand how they're getting the information.
And I often say that time is the new currency, but can you tell me a little bit more about why you believe that digital identity is actually the new currency, especially in this information age that we all find ourselves in?
Okay, so we'll take from that back in time, just zoom all the way to the present, right? Yeah. And put in place a modern stock exchange and everything of the economy today. We are looking at a change in how we evaluate companies due to digital. And it's a bit of a trailing trend. But if you think about how, say, a Wall Street analyst covers any of the big Silicon Valley tech firms, right? They'll use certain metrics that would never apply to analog, pre-digital transformation businesses. Things like monthly active users, right? An analog business doesn't have users, let alone the difference between inactive and active users as a proxy for understanding the total addressable market that they're going to be able to handle at any given time, and therefore extrapolate what that company is worth, and et cetera. The exercise that really the market is supposed to do, which is pricing and saying this is what is valuable. So as these businesses start to digitally transform, we're starting to kind of lose them in the middle of two different methods. And the first method, the method that's been there since the beginning in some ways, is DCF, or discounted cash flows. And the method that's emerging is starting to be things like monthly active users, and there's a lot of innovation happening in the space. I don't think we've landed on one method, but digital valuation in some way. And so what I mean when I say that identities are going to be the thing that helps us cross that divide, that really unlock your ability to be viewed as a digital business in real terms, in market terms, is it's the same way that you would look at a Google or a Facebook or an Amazon. It's how many users do you have? How many of them are active? What do you know about them? What demand can you then satisfy for them? And that's, if you don't know your customers in a digital identity format, if you don't have a way of answering those questions, it's very hard to approximate what value you're providing in a digital context, right? I mean, this is just not something that we can use to evaluate analog companies. So as those analog companies start to become digital companies, the key part, the keystone, if you like, of their future value is going to be being able to answer that question and say, these are the customers, here's how many users I have, here's what I'm actually doing for them, especially as business leaders are expected to make many, many, many more decisions over a given time frame. I mean, to your point, Neil, time being currency, I think they're not mutually exclusive. I think they're actually part of the same story, which is if business leaders are expected to make decisions faster and faster over a shorter amount of time, in the age of digital customer-centric transformation, then do they have the information about those customers to inform those decisions? And if they do or they don't, that will help us determine, not only their prognosis and the prospects that they would have for the future, but also what are they worth today and what should their stock be priced at? And we're going to see that start to become more and more a tension that needs to be resolved or finessed.
Absolutely. And I'm curious, how do you think Earn IT Act, privacy, and how COVID-19, how do you see all those things changing focus on things that matter? Are you seeing any trends or any insights that you can share around that?
Sure. COVID-19, I think properly understood, is digital accelerant in this context.
Yeah.
These things were already happening, but we certainly got a very good reason for accelerating them and for doing them. I mean, I think the lowest common denominator of the effect of COVID on business is that any business leader that was saying we should delay some type of digital transformation is now kind of taking a back seat and perhaps reevaluating that position. The effect on governments is also interesting to look at, especially as the private sector, where you would expect this digital transformation to live, starts to catch the attention of the public sector. There are countries, as I mentioned, that are rolling out digital identity platforms so that you can log in and get government services or fulfill your obligations in some way, pay taxes, pay a fine. And they strike me as very similar to where we were about 15 years ago in the private sector, when digital payments were really the bleeding edge. And so the public sector is taking the best from the private sector and putting it in place to digitally transform the government. But once they've gotten that kind of on the blocks, there's going to be this interplay between the private sector and the public sector that's playing out. I mean, most notably, I think there's a lot of thinkers right now who believe that the digital platforms are currently more powerful than governments. And that's because they know more about the citizenry of that government. And if you don't know what your customer wants, you can't supply that demand. If you also don't know your citizens, then you can't govern very well, right? I mean, governments have always been the source of so much data because they run studies because they need to understand who they are governing, at least in the modern paradigm. So I think COVID, if you think about those two areas, the private sector and the public sector, COVID not only accelerated the private sector and really proved to the governments, gave them a mandate to become digitized, if you will, but we also skipped a bunch of steps that were in our history without this pandemic, which were perhaps the stress that digital identity applied to government would have presented to certain constituencies, the distrust that people have in certain governments that are armed with technologies. And we're just sort of giving that up because we're going, well, there's an exigent circumstance. There's a reason why we need to do contact tracing. There's a reason that justifies this. And so we have to be very, very careful in that respect because you can't go back in time. Once you give something up like that, it's very, very hard for it to be taken away because there isn't really a counter force to something as strong as the pandemic. That said, if you say slow down in this current context with the pandemic, it's sort of falling on deaf ears. Everyone is looking for how quickly that they can respond because there's such a legislative and political reward for speed and being held up as the example of the people that did it right, so to speak. So I think COVID properly understood is going to have an effect on the private sector that was already kind of happening. And I think it's radically changed how government is going to develop over the next 10 years from a digital perspective, because now digital governments are building digital identities, and they don't have the normal resistance that they might without the pandemic in place.
Yeah, I completely agree, especially around it being a digital accelerant as well. But again, I'm curious, are there any aspects of digital life that you think will be normalized by COVID-19? Is there anything that stands out there?
Well, the obvious one is remote working.
Yeah.
I think the less obvious one is the fact that there's now no service that can't reach you on your terms that you're really spending a lot of money on, if that makes sense. I mean, businesses have to meet their customers on their terms now. If you were expecting your customer to come to you, to come to your store, to come to your bank branch, to come to whatever, I mean, that's really the thing that I think is going to be, even though it's a known, I don't think it's a known in that I don't think everyone understands the tertiary effects of that sort of shift. And the easiest way to identify, the cracks that are beginning to show here is the changes in service that you're going to experience when we do open back up, because the budgets have gone, fully away from anything analog or having to do with place. And so there's a lot of processes that are breaking because we jumped to digital for so many of these businesses. We didn't necessarily smoothly do the service design necessary to transfer into digital. And that's also why the word transformation, transformation isn't something that is usually very successful the faster it happens. It's the type of thing that, just like that homeostasis point, just like our identities, slow change can often be the better change. But this context that we're in right now, I mean, we need to change so many things so quickly that it can be overwhelming. I think if you don't have a digital identity system in place, it's going to be that much harder to contend with the fact that you can't go back in time and start with one in place, especially as your business starts to be evaluated, based on what you know about the customer, as opposed to what you can do with what you know about the customer.
And for years, of course, we've also been uploading our selfies online without even thinking about it. But we're now beginning to learn that companies such as Clearview AI have been scraping billions of those selfies from social media platform to power its facial recognition system that it then sells to law enforcement systems. Do you think it's too late to erase our digital footprint and delete ourselves from the internet? Or what's the answer, do you think?
Well, so this is where the perspective I'll give you is sort of, if you've heard of accelerationism as a philosophy, the fact that if you speed things up, you might break them in good ways. I think that's what we're going to have to deal with. So in answer to your question, Neil, I don't think there's any way of going back. I think the only way is forward. However, it's probably more of what's ailing us that's going to cure us, namely deep faking. Because if you can deep fake anything, right? If you can, and for those who don't understand deep faking, it's basically using a machine to alter a picture or place, words in somebody's mouth that look very, very much like that person on video, but it's not them. The ability to shift or change any piece of content into something that could be faked content means that to some extent it won't matter if there are so many pictures out on the internet of you. I mean, let's go to the worst case, of you in compromising circumstances. Well, a picture of you in compromising circumstances could just as easily be deep faked in the future, not right now, but very soon. So I think that this belief that we see everything on the web as sort of authentic, that's actually the problem. Because when you go into an open field, I mean, there's a famous Supreme Court case that says if you go into an open field and scream, I have brown hair or I have blue eyes, you have no expectation of privacy because you're in an open field and you're yelling it out. So you have to expect that reasonably people are going to hear it. That's sort of been the last few years. I mean, that's the last decade of us putting all of these pictures online and information. So there's no way to undo that. What there is a way to do is to call it all into question. Once the ability to fake any of it is possible, that means that anything could be faked, and therefore nothing is necessarily reliable enough to say, oh, that's definitely you in a compromising scenario, which will bring us to the next issue, which is the authentication crisis. But I don't think you need to worry too much about all those pictures from college. You just need to make sure that that you know about them, and that if they come up, you can claim or not claim that they're authentic, and the laws will probably reflect that You're already seeing Facebook start to put out some rules, like it's no longer, I can tag Neil Hughes in a picture. I need to ask Neil Hughes's permission before I tag it. And what we'll see is I'll need to ask your permission before I even upload it. And then I think we'll be back to some sense of stability.
Definitely. I think we're also seeing firms such as Facebook there. They had a big reputation and for the motto, move fast and break things. But I think there's a definite change of attitude out there, and they're now starting to consider the consequences of their creations and pulling back to a certain degree. But looking at the evolution of the internet, how do you think we got to this point, and what does the future look like?
Well, there's been two versions of the internet so far, at least. If you read the folks who kind of do the very modern archaeology of the internet, Web 1.0 and Web 2.0. Web 1.0 were posters on the web that you could scroll, but if you clicked, it really just took you to another poster. There wasn't anything that you could do with it. Web 2.0, the logged in web, also called the logged in web, was when you can access certain functions. The website starts interacting with you. And Web 3.0, sometimes referred to as the decentralized web or the asynchronous web, is when the web itself starts to interact with you, and it's not necessarily one-to-one with your interactions with it. And so we're coming up on that very soon. Most notably, the battleground for this area pushing forward is chatbots and conversational commerce, conversational marketing, asynchronous messaging. All of these things are attempts to make the machine come to you so that there is no keyboard. There's no need to do this. And people refer to it as IoT, but it's not. IoT is just the foundation upon which that lives. It's a really different way of thinking about the internet as something that is persistent as opposed to something that is reactive or triggered by your behavior. And so the way we got here is very simple. All three of these phases of the web have one thing in common. They are increasing degrees of the desire to understand who you are and what you want. And that's really the chief concern that the internet has been focused on for the last 2 decades. And the reason why after the dot-com bust, which there were a lot of great ideas, and you didn't have the value drivers of the advertiser-supported web, which is based off of learning as much about you as possible, right? So that you can offer those ads. So if you catch what I'm saying, the way to kind of project this into the future and to put on our futurists hat is that if the web has been trying to learn everything about you possible, there's going to be a breaking point at which what they can learn about you is either so saturated that everyone can figure it out. That's one possibility. Or you yourself are owning your own digital identity. There's a lot of work being done in this space, so that in order to know things about you, they need your consent. And that would be one possibility, and a lot of legislation is aimed at trying to get there. And the third possibility is we stay the same, and there's some way of dealing with it ex post facto. And so I think that's the question, that if you want to look into the crystal ball, it's not many different futures. It's one of those three, or perhaps something on that spectrum of, do you believe that the web is going to continue trying to learn as much as it can about you and offer that primarily to advertisers? Or do you think it's going to go towards something where we have more control over what is known about us, and then the web has to respond and sort of shift to that? And I mean, just to give you my guess, and this is something that I'll reserve the right to erase the second that we see exactly how it turns out. But I think trending right now, what we're heading to is somewhere in the middle. I think what we're going to see is the advertiser-supported web start to saturate and fall away, and the subscription-based web start to show up. So it'll still be about knowing things about you, but there will be a sense of agency that you have, as opposed to all the machines surveilling you. You'll at least know who's on the other end of that machine. You'll at least be able to say, would you come here, Mr. Watson, if you're Alexander Graham Bell, right? To try to understand who's on the other. We're going to get caller ID is another way of saying it. I think that's probably where we're going to go. After that, it's anyone's guess.
Love that. Well, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today. Before I let you go, could I just ask that you remind everyone listening of where they can find you guys online, and also contact your team if they've got any questions after listening to our conversation today?
Sure. You can look us up on publicissapient.com. We have a number of ways of contacting us there. You can also just look for me, Max Kirby. I'm on all the major platforms. And I had a great time, Neil. Thanks for having us on.
No, thank you so much for joining me, especially making sense of the complexity of the digital identity and who we are on the web. And I love how you are personally making sense of it all with this unique perspective that you have by combining your philosophy background and your tech career too. Very insightful, very enjoyable. And I'd love to get you back on in the future. But more than anything, just thanks for joining me today. In over 1,350 interviews, Max, I think, is the first guest to have combined a unique perspective by combining his philosophy background and career in technology. And I love him all the more for it. And I loved hearing his insights. And hope you enjoyed this one as much as I did. But if you have any opinions or insights to share on the subject of digital identity, or you've just got a question you want to ask me, or you want to come on the podcast, email me, techblogwriter@outlook.com. My social channels are just Neil C. Hughes. If you look for me on LinkedIn, Instagram, Twitter, etc. And my website is techblogwriter.co.uk, where you'll find over 1,350 podcast interviews and also how you can work with me to help you launch your own podcast by letting me worry about editing audio files and uploading to Spotify, etc. Or also how I can help you with business and thought leadership articles. But other than that, keep those questions coming in and I'll return tomorrow with another guest for your listening pleasure. So that means, of course, all that's left for me to say is thank you for listening. And until next time, don't be a stranger.
Thank you for listening to the Tech Talks Daily Podcast with Neil C. Hughes. Remember, technology works best when it brings people together.